Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this webinar about ERA's Shovel-Ready Challenge. My name is Mark Summers, and I'm the Executive Director of Technology and Innovation for Emissions Reduction Alberta, or ERA.
And I'm Steve MacDonald, the CEO for ERA. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today.
Steve and I will be trading back and forth today from a safe physical distance as we talk about our recently announced Shovel-Ready Challenge, and we'll both be here after the presentation to answer questions during the Q&A period. Before we get into the agenda, I'd like to start by going through a few housekeeping items just to make sure we get the most out of our time today. First of all, we're expecting a few hundred participants today, so everyone's microphone is muted to avoid unintentional background noise. If you encounter technical challenges related to the webinar connection, please feel free to email our colleague Amanda using info@eralberta.ca, and she will try to help where possible. However, if you can't resolve your technical issues, or if you need to leave early, please note that we will be posting a recording of the webinar onto our website. The recording will include both the presentation and the live Q&A. In terms of an agenda for today, we plan to cover a few items that will hopefully be informative for everyone on the line. First, Steve will talk briefly about ERA and our mandate. Next, we'll provide an overview of the Shovel-Ready Challenge. We'll cover some key points regarding scope and eligibility for the call, the submission process, and the timelines around the funding decision. We'll also provide some advice for anyone who's interested in making a submission. And finally, we'll end off by answering some of your questions. So if you have any questions you'd like us to address, type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We will answer as many questions as we can, but if we don't address your question, you're most welcome to follow up with us afterward. With that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Steve, who will get things started with an overview of ERA.
Thank you, Mark. It was just 10 days ago that Premier Jason Kenney and Minister Jason Nixon announced a commitment of up to $280 million for 3 ERA programs. This funding includes up to $100 million in tier funding from the province and $100 million from the federal government's Low Carbon Economy Leadership Fund. And, as is always the case with ERA, this funds will be leveraged even further by other public and private dollars, leading to projects we expect to be valued at approximately $900 million. It's also our expectation that these programs will result in around 5,000 jobs and cut an estimated 13 million tons of emissions. But today we're going to focus on the $150 million Shovel-Ready Challenge. I do want to acknowledge that this $280 million funding also includes up to $55 million for our new Energy Savings for Business program, which focuses on new energy savings for businesses. These and it also includes a $75 million boost to our existing partnership intake program. This commitment of both provincial and federal funding will help us unlock the development and deployment of the technologies we need to stimulate the economy now and create the lower emission industries of the future. You know, I know there's been a lot of funding announcements lately, and we know that many companies have limited resources to respond to these calls for proposals. We want to assure everybody we are working closely with our colleagues at Alberta Innovates, Alberta Environment and Parks, and other ministries to make sure there is clarity and alignment between all these programs. We have designed a process that is respectful of the challenges you are facing. It's going to be a tough competition, no doubt, but it won't be unduly onerous. We will work together to ensure that we are maximizing the value of these pools of money and minimizing the complexity for you, the applicants. Mark will share a bit more details on this in a little while. ERA has a proven track record of fulfilling the vision, mandate, and strategic priorities that you see on this slide. When the Premier announced her funding on November 2nd, he made it clear that companies must demonstrate they are serious about improving their environmental performance and lowering emissions if they want access to capital. ERA's investments ensure Alberta has competitive industries that deliver sustainable environmental outcomes, attractive investment, create jobs, and grow our GDP. Our vision is anchored in the belief that our success is measured in both economic and environmental terms. We fondly refer to this as our genius of and vision. The two outcomes are not mutually exclusive. ERA funds technology that deliver the greatest potential for economic growth and emissions reduction, projects that will be widely adopted by industry. And our portfolio reflects this. It aligns with both Alberta's economic and environmental priorities. And our projects span all sectors and timescales. These investments are guided by our technology roadmap, which define the pathways and areas of focus for ERA's funding portfolio. We regularly review this document to ensure we are being responsive to the changing needs of the province's industries, innovators, and investors. 2020 has sure taught us that things can change quickly, so we invest a lot of time speaking to project partners to keep our finger on the pulse of how industry and businesses are being impacted by current economic and health conditions. Our roadmap defines 4 areas of focus: cleaner oil and gas, low-emitting electricity supply and demand, food, fiber, and bio industries, and lastly, low-carbon industrial processes and products. As Mark will tell you, all of these areas will come into play for our shovel-ready challenge. We know that significant investments are required to identify and scale up the innovation that will ensure Alberta succeeds at a lower emissions world. At ERA, our role is to help de-risk the most promising technologies, the ones that are closest to commercial deployment. Since 2009, we have committed $611 million to support 185 projects valued at over $4.4 billion. The large project value reflects our ability to leverage more than 6-to-1 funding from project partners. These investments will also lead to the creation of the equivalent of almost 22,000 person-year jobs by 2024 and contribute over $3 billion to Alberta's GDP. And equally important, we are on track to deliver cumulative GHG reductions of almost 35 million tons by 2030. This good work must continue. Before I hand things over to Mark, I want to point out that ERA designs challenges that involve the rigorous 2-stage competitive process. In both recent challenges, the natural gas challenge and the food farming and forestry challenge, we were significantly oversubscribed. For example, in the natural gas challenge, there was almost $1 billion worth of requests against a $50 million pool of available funding. We expect the same level of demand in the shovel-ready challenge. Your expression of interest must be shovel-ready and shovel-worthy. Just to be reviewed, it must check all the boxes, providing jobs, lower greenhouse gas emissions, and de-risking technology to make our industries more competitive. One final thought for all of you. There's a lot of talk about the importance of pipelines, not just to Alberta, but for Canada's future success. This shovel-ready funding opportunity and all the related tier funding announcements are about building an equally important pipeline, an innovation pipeline, a pipeline that takes the best ideas all the way through scale-up to ultimately deliver the products and services that will transform our industry and society. Solving today's greenhouse gas challenges through the creation and deployment of tomorrow's technologies across all emission sources is essential. And both our provincial and federal governments, through this $150 million investment, have confirmed that innovation will be the engine of growth for the next normal. And with that, I'll turn things back over to Mark.
All right, thank you, Steve. For the next few minutes, I'd like to share some of the details of ERA's newest competition, our Shovel Ready Challenge. And to provide you with some context around the impetus for this initiative, we all know that Alberta is facing unprecedented uncertainty and disruption due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the global collapse in oil prices, and the instability of financial markets and economies around the world. These impacts have resulted in projects across the province being delayed or outright canceled. Many jobs have been lost, and there's an urgent need to respond to these near-term threats. The conversations we've had with folks around the province have revealed a clear need for both short-term and sustained efforts to support businesses and innovators, to accelerate Alberta's recovery efforts, and to position the province for long-term success. In the Shovel Ready Challenge, ERA will be making up to $150 million available to support innovative shovel-ready and near shovel-ready projects that can attract investment, create and preserve jobs, stimulate the economy, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This includes up to $100 million from the province of Alberta and up to $50 million from the Government of Canada through the Low Carbon Economy Fund. And just to be clear, when we say shovel-ready or near shovel-ready projects, what we mean is that projects proposed will need to commence within 60 days of funding approval. And that doesn't necessarily mean shovels in the ground within 60 days, but we want to see meaningful activity and deployment of resources within that 60-day period. We're not expecting applicants to have all elements of a shovel-ready project finalized at the time of submission. For example, all regulatory approvals, detailed engineering, all financing secured, and others. However, proposals will be assessed based on their overall state of readiness and potential for significant economic activity rapidly following ERA funding approval. We're looking for large-scale pilots, demonstrations, and deployment projects with large-scale potential for economic benefits and greenhouse gas reductions across Alberta's economy and across ERA's strategic focus areas that Steve mentioned earlier. And finally, the scope of this call is divided into two funding streams. We're looking for both Greenfield projects, which includes new facilities, new operations, as well as major expansions and new production lines at existing facilities, and also Brownfield projects, which includes improvements and enhancements to existing facilities and operations, such as technology retrofits, process improvements, and innovative fuel switching conversions. So I want to emphasize that this call is open to opportunities across Alberta's economy and across ERA's focus areas that Steve talked about. Anything innovative with large-scale potential to stimulate economic activity and reduce greenhouse gas emissions could potentially fit the scope. But just to lay out a few examples, we think there are potential opportunities, significant potential opportunities in areas such as novel low-carbon products, new industrial processes, electricity system advancements, digital optimization, CCUS, methane management, agriculture and forestry innovation, enhancement of carbon sinks, and transportation solutions, just to name a few. As I said, these are provided as examples only. I have no doubt that there are projects and new technologies out there that aren't on our radar screen. We see that in every challenge we put out. This call is open to all categories of lead applicants. But in order to be successful, I would suggest that having some of the key partners in place will be critically important. For example, the site host or the technology provider. As such, partners between organizations are always encouraged to apply. These types of collaborations can often represent a strong value proposition by marrying the strengths of different talent pools and garnering the capacity necessary to carry out complex projects. I'd also like to take a moment to encourage applicants, those on the line, those applying for funding, to engage and to include Alberta's post-secondary institutions and Indigenous groups in project consortia where appropriate. These arrangements can offer multiple benefits, including, for example, the attraction and training of highly skilled workers, providing additional channels, additional channels for knowledge sharing, increasing Alberta's innovation capacity, and providing social benefits across the province. So I'd like to talk about some important eligibility considerations for the Shovel Ready Challenge. Let me start by emphasizing that we fund projects. By this, I mean there must be clear objectives, milestones, timelines, deliverables, and a budget. The goal is to take technology from point A to point B in terms of accelerating it toward commercialization. And the maximum length for projects funded under this call is 3 years from initiation of the project. And preference will be given for projects that involve significant capital spending in Alberta within 12 months of funding approval. We know that good ideas and good technology can come from anywhere. So applicants and technology providers can be Albertan, can be Canadian, or from outside of Canada. However, while technology and applicants can come from anywhere in the world, projects through this challenge must be piloted, demonstrated, or implemented here in Alberta. There is no strict maximum for the number of EOIs that can be submitted by any given applicant. However, we strongly suggest that you bring forward only the most promising and highest quality submissions for consideration. Steve already talked about generally how we're 10 to 1, or in some cases more, oversubscribed in terms of the funding requests that we get. And finally, I should note that projects with existing funding approval from ERA are not eligible to apply for further funding through this call. However, if you have a project in our portfolio already and you're struggling to move your project forward, we're always happy to have a conversation about whether there's anything we can do to help. On a per project basis, we're making up to $15 million available as the maximum funding request through this challenge, with a minimum funding request of $2 million. ERA can match funding toward eligible expenses on a one-to-one basis, which means that we can support up to 50% of the eligible project costs. We do have a detailed cost eligibility document that's available on our website, as well as in our submission portal. And as a final note on this slide, I should mention that projects selected to receive dollars through ERA from the Low Carbon Economy Fund from the Government of Canada will need to demonstrate direct greenhouse gas emission reductions from the project by 2030, and will also need to comply with the terms and conditions of that fund. Okay, I want to take a minute to mention that ERA is committed to knowledge sharing and to maximizing the impact of our investments across the province. For any project that receives funding from ERA, recipients will be required to report on the outcomes of the project, the achievements, and the lessons learned. This includes direct greenhouse gas reductions, future greenhouse gas potential, job creation, and other environmental, economic, as well as social benefits. In addition to that, ERA may require recipients to commit to specific activities such as hosting knowledge sharing workshops or participation in an ERA hosted lessons learned event. Speaking of which, as a quick plug here, we have a lessons learned event planned for the morning of November 18th, focused on 3 groundbreaking technology solutions for in situ oil sands production. Please feel free to visit our website to register. So I'll run through our submission and evaluation process here, and on the next slide, I'll talk about the timelines of this process. As you can see in the diagram, we have a 2-stage evaluation process followed by execution of the project. In the expression of interest, or EOI stage, applicants are invited to provide an overview of their proposed project. This is a relatively short document, 8 pages maximum, and must be submitted using our online system by the December 22nd deadline. As a quick heads up, we will not be extending the deadline and we will not accept late submissions. After all the EOIs have been submitted, they are then evaluated by a team of independent experts. We bring together a team of evaluators with subject matter expertise in business, in financing, science, engineering, and of course, greenhouse gas quantification. After the EOI evaluation process is complete, a short list of projects will be invited to submit a full project proposal, which includes more detail about the proposed project itself, the expected outcomes of the project, and the plan for implementation of the project. At the full proposal stage, a proposal advisor is assigned to each of the applicants at the time the full proposal invitation is sent out. This advisor is made available to help guide applicants through the process and to provide feedback, if requested, for the full proposals and oral presentations while they're under development. After the FPPs are submitted, they are again evaluated by an independent team of experts, and all full proposal applicants will be invited to offer presentation to the entire evaluation team. This process then culminates with an in-depth review meeting where all projects are discussed in detail and a recommendation is brought forward to our board of directors for consideration. All final funding decisions are made by ERA's board of directors. After the funding decisions are made, we enter into a legal agreement with the successful applicants that details the terms and obligations of each party as it relates to our contribution and to completion of the project. ERA's funding is distributed on a milestone by milestone basis, and the progress of each project is monitored and reported on throughout the course of the project. At the end of the project, all recipients are required to produce a final outcomes report, which is ultimately shared publicly for the broader benefit of Alberta. And the final thing to note about our process is that the entire process is overseen by an independent fairness monitor that reports directly to ERA's board of directors. And this evaluation process all happens between now and spring of 2021. The deadline for submissions, as I mentioned already, is December 22nd, 2020 at 5 p.m. Mountain Time sharp. The projects that are shortlisted in the EOI phase will be notified before or by February 12th of 2021 and will have until late March to submit full proposals. Oral presentations will be scheduled in early May, and applicants will be notified of ERA's funding decision after our board meeting in early June. From there, successful recipients will have 60 days to commence the proposed projects. So before we move on to the Q&A portion of the agenda, I want to offer some general advice on how to prepare a successful application. First, I would recommend that you start the process now. From now, today, until the submission deadline, there is just under 6 weeks of time. We know that it doesn't take 6 weeks to write an 8-page application. However, it does take time to forge partnerships, cement relationships, get internal approvals, and allocate resources. And while you don't, as I said, need to have every internal approval and every partnership finalized by the EOI submission deadline, the further along you are in those processes, the better off you are in terms of demonstrating that your project is real and ready to advance. As I mentioned earlier, projects will be evaluated on their overall state of readiness at both the EOI and the full proposal stage. Next, since all submissions need to be completed through our online portal, just go there to register an account if you don't have one already. It's open for submissions now. Get that part of the process out of the way. And if you do have an account, if you've made a submission to ERA before, that's great. But please go back there and make sure you can still log in. That's one headache you don't want to run into the day that you're making your submission. Okay, next, and I can't emphasize this one enough, is to read the call for expressions of interest document. It's not a long document, and it answers most of the questions we get on a regular basis. If you have a project that is not eligible or doesn't fit with this call for proposals, you can save yourself a lot of time by reading the guidelines document now and figuring that out sooner rather than later. And so this next point is really an extension of the last one, and that is to review the evaluation criteria which are provided in that call for expressions of interest document. These are the criteria upon which each proposal is evaluated and shortlisted. And each of these criteria have different weightings. While ERA generally looks for many of the same elements for a successful project, the criteria in this challenge are a little bit different from our previous challenges. They're shown on the slide here. All of these criteria are important and all of them need to be addressed. Okay, building on that last point, when you're completing the expression of interest document, it's important to use clear language and to address all the points laid out in the template. Our evaluation team consists of subject matter experts, but if they can't decipher the information that's necessary to make a qualified assessment, or if the 8-page document is filled with extraneous information, for example, that review team won't have the confidence to move the application forward in the process. And speaking of the 8-page limit, I think it's worth noting that you are welcome to include optional letters of support. These letters of support do not count as part of the 8-page limit and can be highly beneficial to providing confidence in the project. And last, but certainly not least, is please do not wait until the last day to submit your application. I can tell you that we have lost good opportunities in the past because of deadlines that were missed, both at the EOI stage and at the full proposal stage. This is a matter of fairness to all applicants, and we are firm on the deadline. If you do have technical issues during the submission process, our IMS team is happy to help resolve those issues and is very responsive to the requests that come in. However, I can tell you that if you wait until the last day, it's entirely possible that we can't address all of the last minute issues that arise. Okay, so before I move on to the questions, I want to take a minute to talk about leveraging funding from our trusted partners. As was mentioned, ERA works in partnership with other funding organizations like SDTC, Natural Resources Canada, and others. In some cases, there may be an opportunity for ERA to share your proposals with our trusted partners and explore the possibility to leverage funding from these organizations. During the submission process, you'll have the opportunity to allow us to share your submissions with our trusted partners, and I encourage you to do so. If you agree to this in the system, ERA will only share your application with partners where we have a non-disclosure agreement in place and for the sole purpose of exploring further funding leverage. Okay, to kick off the questions for this afternoon, I want to start with a small number of questions that we seem to be receiving quite frequently. Some of these questions might be in the Q&A panel already. I haven't looked, so I'll try to address them early. The first is whether applicants can submit to ERA's shovel-ready challenge if they've already applied to the IEE CCUS program that was launched by Alberta Environment and Parks and referenced to by Steve earlier. And the answer to this question is yes. To the extent that your project is aligned with ERA's shovel-ready challenge, there's no harm in submitting an application, even if you've submitted one already to the department's program. I should note that we are working closely with Alberta Environment and Parks, as well as with Alberta Innovates, and we want to ensure that the strongest projects are funded. So there may be an opportunity for the department to share information with us. However, since their criteria and information requirements are different from ours, my best advice is to submit directly to ERA if you want to ensure the best opportunity for success. The second question we're receiving a lot is seeking clarification around the 60 days after funding approval requirement, and also the preference for capital investment within 12 months. What does this mean? Well, to be clear, neither of these mean that the project needs to be constructed or commissioned within 60 days, or even a year for that matter. As I said, the maximum project length is 3 years under this call. And by the end of 3 years, that's when we expect to see things up and running, to see commissioning and deployment of new projects. What it does mean, though, is that we want to see the projects kicked off and the deployment of resources within 60 days. And we also want to see capital investments made as rapidly as possible after ERA funding approval. Which is a good segue to the next question, which is around FEED studies and other pre-construction work. Projects that only involve pre-construction work are not eligible for funding in this competition. However, a 3-year project, for example, that starts with detailed engineering or finishing off a front-end engineering design study, for example, but concludes with commissioning or deployment of a project is eligible. And finally, I already touched on this, but it's worthwhile repeating that this call is not just open to Alberta-based companies. Good projects and good ideas can come from anywhere. However, as I mentioned already, we want those projects to be built in Alberta. And for companies outside of Alberta, generating employment and reducing greenhouse gas emissions within the province will be important. Okay, so this is my last slide before we open the floor for further questions, but I wanted to take a minute to build on a couple of the frequently asked questions that we've received and build on what Steve mentioned earlier. And that is specifically about coordination and overlap amongst the funding programs recently announced by the Government of Alberta. 3 of the most closely related programs are shown here. And at the most basic level, the primary difference between the programs is the stage of technology development. The $50 million program announced by our friends and close partners at Alberta Innovates is focusing on earlier stage technology advancements, more specifically in the technology readiness levels of TRL 4 to 7 or so. ERA's Shovel Ready Challenge comes next in the progression, so to speak, with a focus on advancing innovation to the stages of TRL 7, 8, and 9, that is large scale, in the field demonstration and deployment projects. And the program launched by Alberta Environment and Parks comes next yet in that progression, focused on ready to deploy projects that don't need to demonstrate an element of new technology or innovation. The department's program is focused on industrial efficiency and CCUS, and their application deadline was on October 30th. I hope that helps provide some clarification information, but again, we're happy to answer further questions about that if you have any. All right, well, if you've made it this far, this is your opportunity now to ask questions for Steve and for me, hopefully more for Steve. Please type your questions into the questions pane of the control panel, which is typically on the right-hand side of your screen. Our esteemed colleague, Michelle Gurney, who leads ERA's communications team, will be selecting the questions and reading them out for Steve and for me to answer. Please say hello to everyone, Michelle. I believe you're on the line now, and feel free to fire away whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Mark. There's so many great questions here, but I am just going to lead off with some follow-up. You were talking in the FAQs, the frequently asked questions about Alberta specifically, and there were, funnily enough, a number of questions about this in the Q&A so far. So I'm just going to add a few. People are looking for a little bit more clarity there on how much of the budget could be spent outside Alberta.
I can jump in on that one. Thanks, Michelle. I think that's a really good question. And I might reframe it a little bit and say that what we don't have is a hard maximum of spending within the province or spending outside of the province. What I would say is that, as I alluded to earlier, ultimately we're looking for large-scale projects that are in the field, commercial demonstrations or commercial deployment, first-of-kind commercial deployment. So we want to see all of that happening. And if there's steel in the ground or rubber hitting the road, we want to see that happening in the province of Alberta. Now, leading up to that, if there's design work or detailed engineering or whatever that happens outside of the province, that's fine. That's fine. But ultimately, we want to see the rubber hit the road and the steel in the ground in the province of Alberta. And so it gives a little bit of flexibility around the amount of spending, particularly for labor costs or things like that. So there's no hard maximum on that amount.
Thanks, Mark. So just another follow-up on that to clarify, do all of the strategic partners have to be Alberta-based?
No, sorry. Thanks, Michelle. That's another really good question. And I apologize to everyone on the line if I wasn't as clear about this as I ought to have been. And the answer is no. In fact, in reality, it could be possible that none of them are Alberta-based if they're moving into Alberta to create a Greenfield project, for example, that happens in the province of Alberta. I mean, normally we'd see, and it's commonplace for there to be an Alberta partner, such as a site host or otherwise, or a financing partner, or strategic partner, whatever the case is, based in Alberta. But no, they don't all need to be based in Alberta. In fact, none of them, strictly speaking, need absolutely to be based in Alberta.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to move around here. There's a couple of questions related to the minimum threshold, and two specifically. One is digital optimization and automation doesn't usually have that high of a capital expenditure. So that was kind of one point somebody made around the minimum threshold. And then there was another question on, can people group smaller projects together and put in one application in order to be able to meet that minimum threshold?
Yeah, really good questions again, Michelle. So in terms of the digital optimization, I hear you, and that's something that we've talked about with our friends and stakeholders and industry partners across the province. Maybe there's a couple things I can mention to that. One is that, as I mentioned, we're looking for large scale projects, and yes, the capital requirement of those types of projects isn't always as significant as it can be for hardware based or equipment based projects. Um, as you talked about in terms of grouping projects, sometimes there are opportunities to ensure that the project is a significant enough scale across a large site or across multiple sites, to ensure that it's a large enough scale project to fit with the intent and the goals of ERA's shovel-ready challenge. The other thing I would mention, and it goes back a little bit to the coordination aspect, is that in the Alberta Innovates portfolio, the slide that I showed talks about the maximum funding on a per project basis of up to from $200,000 up to $5 million within the Alberta Innovates program. And so even though some of the digital optimization technologies, TRL is sometimes a little bit of a nebulous concept for those types of projects, but there's a lot of interest within Alberta Innovates to advance some of these digital optimization programs, in addition to ERA, if it does happen to be a smaller scale project and not fit within that $2 million to $15 million envelope. And then to your second question around grouping projects, I'll offer a couple of thoughts around this one. The first is that, yes, grouping multiple sites together to make a larger and a more meaningful demonstration or meaningful first of kind deployment in the province is something that we encourage, and we encourage you to think about in terms of putting together a large scale meaningful project. I want to be careful, and it's maybe a little bit semantic, but I think the way you'd worded the question is about grouping projects together. I'd offer people a caution of being careful not to group things that are too different together. For example, if it's a digital optimization project that spans across multiple sites, to me that seems to make a lot of sense. But if it's talking about different technologies and different focus areas with different feedstocks and a lot of differences between the projects, it sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense to merge those together into a larger super project, just so you can request more money out of ERA, for example.
And Michelle, Steve here, what I would add to Mark's response is a reminder to folks considering making an application is that this call is very much focused on economic stimulus. This really is about delivering those outcomes of getting Alberta back to work, creating jobs, and delivering environmental outcomes. So we had to draw a line around it in some way. And the $2 million limit is, we believe, demonstrates the potential for outcomes in that space. Digitization, optimization, really exciting area, but it has to drive to those outcomes around economic stimulus as well. There'll be other calls for sure, but as people think this through and they recognize what a competitive process this will be, is those metrics will be important. And that's why we drew the line in the sand around $2 million, because we thought that was the scope and scale that Alberta needs now in terms of that economic stimulus and deriving toward those improved environmental outcomes.
Thanks for that, Mark and Steve. Just a follow-up question related to that. And I believe this was covered early on, but I just want to verify, is technological innovation the only kind of innovation that would be accepted through this challenge?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Another really great question. So I want to be careful about how I answer this. Primarily, we're looking for technology innovation and advancing technology toward commercialization. Now, there is some flexibility around that. We know that innovation can come in a variety of forms, and that quote unquote technology innovation can involve innovative aspects of a project that are beyond technology, strictly speaking, so to speak. And so we want to hear what the innovative opportunities are. Sometimes that can mean configuring existing technologies in a new and innovative way, or bringing technology into the province of Alberta that's been demonstrated elsewhere but hasn't been demonstrated in Alberta due to a number of reasons. However, on the flip side, what I would say is that applicants will need to demonstrate some sort of innovation in order to be considered eligible for this call for proposals. And that innovation, largely speaking, can be technological. It can sometimes encompasses non-technological aspects, but we need to be assured that if we're providing funding for a project, it's not for the sole purposes of reducing a financial barrier to success of something that's commercially available, off the shelf, readily available technology. There needs to be some innovative de-risking component that warrants the de-risking and sharing of government dollars in partnership with private industry.
Yeah, Michelle, what I would add is that we recognize there's a real tension between the idea of shovel-ready and innovation. It almost seems to contradict each other. In our mind, what we're really talking about is sort of the shorter term versus the longer term game changers. But to Mark's point, we have a core mandate to de-risk technology. So the projects that will rise to the top are the projects that can demonstrate, just as Mark described, that there is an element of the proposal that has not been proven at scale and that needs the public money to push it across the finish line. But there is a gray area there. And for the ROI stage, I would encourage people to, if they have this opportunity to push it in front of us, then maybe it'll give us an opportunity to understand what the range and scope of possibilities out there are. And it allows us to create an awareness to even to inform our next calls. So we appreciate this is a bit of a contradiction in terms of shovel ready, yet our business is about de-risking technologies. But we think there is a pool of projects out there that'll nicely fit that tension.
Thanks for explaining that. There's another really good question here. We've been talking a lot about stimulus, and the question here is actually about the weighting on both GHG and economic benefits. And so the question is, I see that both of those are given a joint weighting of 40. Are economic benefits or GHG reductions given equal weight in the application overall?
Sure, I can jump in on that one, Michelle. Thanks very much for the question. You know, I would say both are critical. And so it's to the extent that a project has strong potential for greenhouse gas emission reductions and strong potential for economic reductions, we're not going to worry so much about the weighting of those two criteria, because they're both critically important, and that's the reason why that category was given a higher weighting than the other two criteria in this call for proposals. So, you know, in the end, I can assure applicants that it won't come down to splitting hairs between slightly better economic benefits versus slightly better greenhouse gas reduction benefits. In the end, projects will need to demonstrate both, and both at a significant scale.
And ERA takes a portfolio approach. So we line up all the projects and say, do we have the right mix of economic stimulus and GHG? So any one project could have a different balance there, but overall on our portfolio, we try to get that right balance. So again, Mark nailed it. On a project by project basis, it's not as critical, that balance, as it is for us as we consider the entire portfolio and the projects we ultimately recommend it to our board for consideration.
Thanks for that. So the next question is really, there's actually a few questions here. People are wondering if they have to forfeit carbon offsets in exchange for funding.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. The short answer to that is no. We don't require applicants to forfeit carbon offsets or carbon credits, whether it's through the tier framework or the offset system or voluntary offset systems in order to be eligible for ERA funding.
Thanks, Mark. So this one, I'm not sure whether Steve or Mark want to cover it, but there is a really good question here. Curiosity about how confidential do we hold the full project proposal data?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. I can jump in on that one as well. I mean, the quick answer is that we treat all of the proposals and the information contained within them as strictly confidential. We don't make publicly available any expressions of interest or full project proposals that are provided to us. We do, as you go through the process, applicants will notice we ask for a non-confidential description of the project. And in a case where a project is awarded funding, we ultimately, if you go to our website, you'll see that we have a blurb about each project that we end up funding. And of course, with our funding recipients, we work with them to ensure that that public description is all right with our team as well as with their team before we make it publicly available. But the proposals are kept confidential. And you know, this, I don't know if this question has come up in your queue, Michelle, but it's one that we've received quite often and is a bit the kind of the flip side to that question around whether or not we can share an example proposal from a project that has been successful. And the answer to that is no. Unfortunately, we treat the confidentiality of information, of technology details very seriously. And because of that, we don't have any applications from past applicants that have been successful that we can share with anyone.
Now, what I'd add is we do share proposals with our trusted partners, but like anybody that touches a proposal, they're bound by non-disclosure agreements. So where an applicant has agreed to allow us to share a proposal, anyone that actually gets their eyes and hands on it is bound by a non-disclosure agreement as well. So we, as Mark said, we honor that and are very diligent in maintaining that confidentiality.
Thanks to you both for that. I want to tack on a question here that came up around if somebody's already submitted something in the Food Farming and Forestry Challenge, can they still submit a project to Shovel Ready as well?
Yeah, essentially what we're doing here is saying that if you're currently receiving ERA funding, you're not eligible to receive additional funding through this call. So if they submitted an unsuccessful application in a previous challenge and it fits the terms and conditions and criteria of this challenge, they're welcome to resubmit.
Thanks, Steve. So I do have a couple of questions around the Brownfield versus Greenfield. Specifically, can you give a little bit more clarity around what you consider Greenfield? And the second part of that is, do you have specific amounts of funding that will go to either of those?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Those are really good questions. To the first question, I would say beyond what's provided in the slide and beyond what's provided in the guidelines document, we don't have specific, a really detailed criteria around what exactly fits Greenfield and what exactly fits Brownfield. So, I mean, largely speaking, Greenfield we're looking for new projects. So that includes new construction, new sites, new projects. Of course, that kind of goes without saying. And then it also includes major expansions at a facility or new product lines at an existing facility. And we realized there could be some gray area between that and between improvements at an existing facility. And that's fine. To be honest, I wouldn't fuss too much about if you're somewhere in that gray zone between a Greenfield project and a Brownfield project about exactly whether you fall on one side of the fence or the other side of the fence, which brings me to the second question. So notionally, what we've identified in the guidelines document is a split of the dollars between the Greenfield stream and the Brownfield stream. But we've been very careful to be clear that we have the opportunity when we're looking at projects to redistribute the money or potentially to move a project that's been submitted to us from one stream into the other stream to ensure that the peer-to-peer comparison and that the independent evaluation is done by the experts that have the most relevant knowledge. And so what I'd conclude by saying in that is again, don't worry too much if you're in that gray zone about which stream you're in, because ultimately which stream that the project is in won't affect the chance of success. Ultimately, in the end, we will be picking the best opportunities that are the strongest opportunities that are best aligned with the evaluation criteria, with the goals of the challenge, and with ERA's mandate. And so in the end, if that means we pick some more brownfield projects than ERA projects, or vice versa, if we pick more greenfield projects than brownfield projects, ultimately we want to pick the best projects that are most well aligned with ERA's mandate and the call.
Thanks for that. The next question, really, there are a number of questions around how the payments are received from ERA. I wondered, Mark or Steve, can either of you just talk a little bit about milestone payments?
Sure, yeah. I can jump in on that, and I can give a high level overview. There's a lot of detail in this regard that it's probably not worth everybody's time if we go into. But ultimately, for the successful applicants, we enter into a legal agreement, a contribution agreement, and in that agreement, we work with the recipients to define a set number of milestones that are outlined in the work plan. And for us, what that means is every time a project milestone is reached, it can trigger a new payment from ERA. And to trigger that payment from ERA, the milestone, as just laid out in the contribution agreement, needs to have been met with all of the key indicators associated with that particular milestone. And when a milestone is complete, recipients will then go into our system, provide us with a progress report, with a financial update, and with an invoice that triggers a payment, a review on our end, as well as a payment from ERA. And the number of milestones can vary. We often like to see, or we often see somewhere between 3 to maybe 7 or 8 milestones over the course of a project, but there's no set amount. We can balance that between the cash flow needs of the organization, as well as between the quote unquote burden or administrative burden of providing ERA with a progress update, with an invoice and a financial update. So I hope that helps to provide a little bit of clarity, but certainly as we go through the process and as we get closer to a contribution agreement, we can work with the approved recipients to ensure that there's sufficient clarity regarding all of the milestone activities.
Yeah, and we're very mindful of the cash crunch and liquidity issues that Alberta industries are facing right now. And ERA has been very responsive to our current portfolio of companies to reach out, understand what those issues are, and look for solutions to help with cash flows and assure projects proceed. But everyone also has to recognize we have risk to manage. So we're open to changes, considering new approaches, issues around holdback amounts, variables that respect the reality that we find ourselves in today, and allow organizations to move forward and allow ERA to manage its risk and ensure that it's getting the value it needs from its investment portfolio. So it's as Mark said, as you approach the documentation and we get all the gory details negotiated, ERA is approaching this with an open mind to make sure we're getting the results, but doing it in a way that manages the risk in terms of our portfolio.
Thanks to you both. You can imagine, you just mentioned cash flow, Steve. We are seeing a lot of questions in the Q&A with questions around this. Specifically, I'm going to ask you one now about the matching dollars, and somebody's wondering if you have to have cash on hand, or what do the matching dollars have to look like? Can they be license fees paid, pledges from strategic partners? How locked in do those have to be?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Another really important question. So there is some flexibility around what that can be. And maybe what I'll start with is what that can't be. And so primarily what we often say that cash matching or fund matching can't be is funding from other federal or provincial government funding organizations. So we can't match NRCan dollars or SDTC dollars. We say, if you look at our guidelines document, we talk about cash contributions toward the project, but there is some flexibility around that. That can be equity investment, it can be debt, it can be secured contributions from partners. It can also be eligible contributions from partners on the project toward things like labor costs that are traditionally referred to as in-kind contributions. And what I would encourage folks to do is to maybe take a quick look at our cost instructions, our cost guidelines document, which lays out the eligible cost on a more detailed basis. And that ultimately will provide some instruction to what sorts of contributions from partners and from the team can be considered eligible and can be matched by ERA.
And again, this is a shovel-ready call. If you don't have a partner at the table with dollars, you don't have the financial means to proceed with a $4 million project, including $2 million of our money, it's going to be tough for you to rise to the top of this competitive call. So people listening need to understand that this is different in that it's shovel ready. This isn't sort of early stage. We need to get all the pieces together. We need a lot of time. If we get your money, then we can raise some more money. There's going to be a different standard in terms of the state of readiness for these projects. So I just encourage people to keep that in mind as they consider whether or not they want to make an application to this call.
Thanks to you both. So we've only got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions if I can here. So there was a question that came early on. Is there any particular focus on a specific GHG or other, like SO2, benzene emissions? Can some of those GHGs be considered in these projects?
Yeah, I can try to answer that one quickly. I think greenhouse gas emissions or greenhouse gases come in a variety of forms. Clearly, I think the consensus is that 2 of the most important are carbon dioxide and methane emissions, but certainly others that have a higher global warming potential, like N2O emissions, sulfur hexafluoride, and others can be important contributors as well. I would maybe go back and remind everyone that the scale of the opportunity is important here. And so that if there are some greenhouse gas emissions, PFCs, HFCs, whatever the case is, where the size of the prize isn't significant, that's something that will have to be discussed and justified through the application process. But strictly speaking, it's greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and there are a number of different categories within greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks, Mark. So last question. There's quite a few questions about what costs are eligible. So I'm not going to get you to share that, but maybe I'll get you to remind everybody where they can find that information.
For sure. Thanks, Michelle. We do have a detailed cost eligibility guidelines document that's available on our website. If you go to our website and specifically seek out the Shovel Ready Challenge page within our website, there's a link to the expressions of interest guidelines document, our cost eligibility document, another frequently asked questions document, our privacy policy, and a number of other pieces of information that are really important for this call.
Thanks, Mark and Steve. I think that's all we have time for. There are a lot of questions left in the Q&A. Lots of great questions came in, so thank you for submitting those. We'll take a look through. Mark, I'll just hand things over to you to close off for today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks everybody for tuning in. That does bring us to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much for your interest and your participation today. As Michelle said, there are a number of unanswered questions, and if you still have questions that you'd like to pose after our webinar and after reviewing the supporting materials, the guidelines document, the cost eligibility document, you're most welcome to email us using applications@eralberta.ca. That's a mailbox that is monitored by a small team to ensure that we try to provide the most timely responses as possible. And finally, as a reminder, we hope to have this webinar posted on our website by the end of this week. Thank you once again and have a wonderful afternoon.